Hello, and a great big welcome back to Women's Business Voice. My name is Angela De Souza, your host, and we are going to be exploring a series called From Side Hustles to Empires, the history of women's working lives, where we'll be featuring a series of conversations between Dr. Amy Edwards and a range of expert historians. The series as a whole will explore the relationship between gender, work, and career in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what isn't, about the nature of women's working lives in Britain. The series will explore not only the success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden histories of women who made a living in a system and structures not often designed with them in mind. This episode is entitled Rags to Riches, Social Mobility and a History of Working Women's Lives, with our very special guest, Dr. Eve Worth. So over to you, Amy.
So welcome. This is our very first episode of this podcast series, where it's mainly going to be me, so Dr. Amy Edwards, talking to a range of expert historians who all in different ways are interested in or touch upon what it was like in the past to be a woman and working, basically. But in this first episode, we're really lucky to be being joined by Dr. Eve Worth, who's here with us, who's going to help us do a couple of things. One, build a bit of a picture of the history of women's relationship to work. I've given us the bold ambition of covering sort of 100 to 150 years. We'll see how we go with that. But also talking to us a bit more specifically about some of the wonderful stuff that her research looks at, which is things like social mobility, adult education, the occupational trajectories of women, particularly after the Second World War. So before we do start that, I will introduce Eve a little more thoroughly. So Eve is a social and women's historian. She works on contemporary Britain, much like myself, and she's based just down the road from where I am at Bristol, down at the University of Exeter. She's particularly interested in women's experiences of social mobility and class. She has also kind of explored women's changing relationship to employment and education. And hopefully today she'll be talking a bit about her recent book, The Welfare State Generation, Women, Agency and Class in Britain since 1945, which was published a couple of years ago now by Bloomsbury. She also does loads of cool stuff. She's involved with the Department of Work and Pensions and their Methods Advisory Group. She does like interdisciplinary work, works with sociologists. It's a really cool kind of set of stuff that Eve gets up to. So really cool that we have her here today. Eve, hello and welcome.
Hello. Nice to be here.
I thought what might be nice, I've obviously just done a bit of a whirlwind introduction of you. But if you could tell us a bit in your own words, something about how you became interested in studying women's lives, things around social mobility, kind of what got you interested in all this stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was thinking about how did I become interested in this? And I think similarly to a lot of historians, it's kind of things that happened in my own present kind of life made me want to think more about it in the past. So when I left undergraduate, which I actually did at Bristol, so I hadn't really done much women's history and I wasn't even thinking about being a historian. I thought I wanted to work in politics. So I did this internship in Parliament and it was so misogynistic. Like I was so genuinely shocked. And it wasn't even like subtextually misogynistic. It was like that new haircut makes your face look fat, or like, you should wear more dresses kind of. That I just got like really riled up and wanted to do more. So I decided to do a master's in women's studies, which is obviously like interdisciplinary, with like lots of ways of thinking about women. And I just like went back to thinking about it historically, but then I just kind of went on to like become interested in women's history. So yeah, it was kind of accidental, which is interesting. And also in terms of specifically social mobility and class, I had like a lot of experiences growing up that were complicated in terms of class and mobility and class dysphoria, like very complicated class background. And I just, when I looked at kind of the history of class or even contemporary versions of class, it was very much like men feel this more explicitly, men have more agency in their own class and mobility, like, and even a lot of the big works on social mobility didn't include women. and it just had no relationship to my own experience and my family's experience of how strongly this experience of class was happening for like the women I knew. So that's how I got into women, and then that's how I got into like really explicitly thinking about kind of women and mobility, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess hopefully we'll be talking over the next couple of episodes about some of these different things. But I guess it's really interesting to think about how gender or being a woman interacts with some of those other
Oh, of
experiences.
course, yeah,
And
yeah,
the idea that women don't have a class is like super fascinating
exactly.
to me.
Yeah, fascinating is one word.
Yeah. So hopefully we're going to get to ask you a bit more about that in just a second. But before we do, I wondered if I could get you to help us out basically
Yeah,
and set us up with a brief history of women's kind of position in society and their relationship to work, sort of going back over the 20th, maybe into the 19th century, depending on how you're feeling. But yeah, give us some of the context we need so that when we come to what happens after World War II, we've got a bit of a picture.
yeah. So there are big changes in the way that kind of women experience work after the Second World War, but I think that in kind of popular understanding, a bit like with class, there's quite a lot of misconceptions about that kind of longue durée of women's relationship to work. Um, I think one reason is that kind of in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, that happens kind of in the late 18th, early 19th century, we do have a period where probably like women were working less than they had before, and early modern scholars are doing a lot of really interesting work on how work's defined even before the Industrial Revolution. Um, but that's in part because work becomes more formalized once you have an industrial revolution. And actually, prior to that, women worked much more in kind of the informal economy, the domestic economy, much more contingently. But working class women have always worked, and they continue to work through the 19th and early 20th century. And again, in a way that's much more complicated relationship to the labour market than men. And a lot of our models of what it looks like to be a worker or what that means are based on a much more kind of straightforward male relationship to the labour market. So yeah, I think it's important to understand that class really defines women's relationship to the labour market, you know, going back hundreds of years. So working class women have always worked in various ways and made that work and kind of had to kind of figure that out for themselves around a more formal labour market. But one of the reasons that we have these images, particularly of the 19th and early 20th century, like women not working, is because it became a middle class ideal in the 19th century for women not to work. So a lot of our ideas about women in the past are actually based on middle class women's experiences. And you know, this idea of like angel in the home, separate spheres, is very much something that came to define the rising Victorian kind of and earlier in the 19th century middle class. Like, you know, you had status if your wife did not work. Um, and so in one way it was kind of, yeah, the ideology of the middle class was for women not to work in the 19th and early 20th century. Um, but there were also formal barriers. So the type of work that middle class women would potentially do, which would be more likely to be professional, there was things like marriage bars that came in the early 20th century. Women were barred from most of the professions until 1919. And so there was kind of informal ideological and formal ways in which middle class women were barred from the labour market. But even then, a lot of the work that becomes professional later, they did as voluntary. So, like, you know, the very first social workers were middle class women, you know, they were very involved in local government. So, even then, it's hard to say that they were totally removed from the public sphere and the labour market. So, I think the big thing to take away is that although things have changed across the 20th century, it's probably much more complicated than what you envisage about how you imagine women in the past, I think.
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. And I guess especially it's interesting hearing you talk about women doing stuff that we would now recognize as like work or we would assume would be like paid
Yeah.
work, but that at different times has not been. And I mean that also, and maybe we'll talk about this later, but we might flip that the other way around, that today there are things that we don't really consider work or aren't often paid, but that definitely are work,
Yeah,
and that at other historical times or in the future, you know, might end up for yeah,
exactly.
just that sort of strange boundary between what counts and what doesn't as work, I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a much more complicated concept. And I think one of the reasons it's interesting to think about women is it disrupts some of those like ideas about straightforward categorizations of what work is or isn't, I think, or what labor is or isn't, which is maybe a better word.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, also this brings us up quite nicely to World War II. So we have these
Yeah.
kind of broader changes, but underlying continuities that are going on. And I guess that kind of brings us to your book, which I mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah.
So it's called The Welfare State Generation. But I wondered if you could actually just tell us a bit more about the book then and kind of what it looks at.
Yeah. So the book uh, covers a generation of women born in the 1940s. So born at that kind of pivotal kind of moment in the 20th century, and it follows them, this one generation of women born in the 1940s. It follows them through their life trajectory. And I think, again, like generation, thinking about particular cohorts of women is also particularly important, especially in periods of rapid change, like we think about the kind of late 20th, early 21st century, because women of different ages can actually be experiencing different decades actually very differently. Life courses is so important to the ways we think about women. So I follow them, yeah, right through to when they retire in the kind of late 2010s, which again is something women in old age and what happens when they leave work or when they're aging is also something we know very little about. So it's a book really about trajectory. But the reason, they're so important to think about is so many changes kind of happen after the Second World War that really kind of are the foundation of changing women's lives. So, and one of the reasons I called it the welfare state generation is because that massive expansion of the welfare state in 1945 is actually very crucial for changing women's occupational and educational trajectories in this period. But it was also something that emerged from what women were saying. So I interviewed women for the book and I didn't have a theme when I went in. And it actually kind of emerged from my discussions with them. And this could be ways of like formally thinking about the welfare state, about how they benefited from it. But also the welfare state is kind of an ideology about the way we think about gender, but also the way kind of economic relations and relations to the state are organized. So it's something that is a way of like, yeah, it's kind of literally what happened to them, but also the ways they think about the public sphere and kind of the social safety net and who should be doing what. So it became this kind of really potent way of thinking about their lives. And I can say a bit more about like the specific educational and occupational changes they experienced. But they also, marriage bars kind of ended after the Second World War. They were allowed to go into professions. There was more kind of scope for all women. And then there were things that this generation were particularly kind of the first to flow through. And some of those occupational and educational changes also led to them being the second wave feminist generation. So some of those actually material social changes leads to then. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that second wave feminism made a lot of changes when actually a lot of changes had happened before to enable women to create second wave feminist movement that were material and economic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you mentioned as you were talking that you did these like life histories. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about what that is as a method for finding
Yeah.
out about the past and how that offers us something different than we might normally get.
Yeah, I mean, oral history, kind of life history interviewing emerges actually interestingly as a second wave feminist methodology in the 1970s.
Hmm.
Um, it has always been a potent method for thinking about women in particular, and because it moves away from kind of top-down ways of thinking, like formal archival records, it brings different voices into the conversation. Um, but one way in which I particularly like to use life history is to give women more space in order to talk about the things they want than perhaps is sometimes used in oral history. So in oral history, people can often take in a kind of a very detailed set of questions, and they want to know specific things, which can be really valuable. But I think that if we're going in with this premise, this idea that looking at women involves questioning categories, kind of questioning our own assumptions, thinking differently about how things might be defined. Sometimes it's useful to give women more space to take the conversation in the direction that they want. And that is what I mean about kind of welfare state emerging. That was a methodological choice to not have a theme and to just say, let's just actually see what emerges from these interviews and the analysis of the interviews. And so I structure the interviews around a life course. So I literally say, like, where were you born? And we end right with retirement. And again, I think an important thing about going right up to retirement is that, well, A, for this generation of women, because work is more important in their lives, then they have a much harder retirement than earlier generations. So there's this idea women are fine with aging because they're not really involved in the labour market. But also oral history can be slightly ageist. It thinks about like younger people's it interviews older people, but then asks them about memories from when they were younger. So I kind of wanted to take women seriously as kind of the subjects they are now, and also, they still exist in historical time. So I think it's a really powerful methodology if we do really want to like challenge some of the ways that we think about the past, which I think is one of the most powerful reasons to do women's history in the first place.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I bet it was such an interesting experience just sitting with people and asking them about their lives and kind of seeing what came up for them and what was important. And yeah, it must have been a really, really interesting experience.
Yeah, it was amazing. And it's always like amazing when you get people to open up about their lives anyway. Like, it always feels like such a privilege. And you always feel so, I think you also always feel a lot of responsibility about, putting that out into the world and making sure that you're not misinterpreting what they say. But what was also interesting is from a perspective of just asking people about their lives, how similar like the trajectories were. It was almost more surprising how kind of the shape of what they're, obviously with differences in different beats, but kind of the big shape of what their trajectories look like was actually remarkably similar. And I hadn't necessarily been expecting that. So in some ways, it was almost easier to analyze than I anticipated, which was nice for me.
And one of the things you mentioned earlier, and that I was interested in, especially thinking of like the beats of people's lives, is education. And I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about women's experiences of education and the changing occupational landscape. If there's this big change in the types of
Yeah.
jobs that seem to be open to women, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so education is really important for women, and it's particularly important when we think about social mobility. So, one thing that we know is that women need educational qualifications more than their male counterparts in order to experience mobility through kind of occupation, because there's this sense of you need this kind of objective piece of paperwork that says, oh, I can achieve this, and it moves away from some of those cultural kind of male assumptions about who would be a good, work colleague or workmate. So the expansion of education is really important for women's mobility. Um, right through this period and into the 21st, still now into the 21st century. So expansion of education is really important, but the expansion of education in the Second World War emerged alongside an expanding and changing economy. So I think historians used to think that there was a lot of social mobility after the Second World War because of changes to education. But changes to education always need to go hand in hand with an expanding economy. And the way in which the expanding economy particularly benefited women is there was an expansion of white collar jobs and also semi-professional jobs. So one of the reasons the economy was expanding is because of the expansion of the welfare state, which provided kind of more jobs in hospitals, more jobs for social workers, more jobs in schools, more jobs in universities. And then this happened again when the welfare state expanded again in the late 1960s, which is sometimes overlooked by historians. So there was two major expansions of the welfare state. So what I found from the women I interviewed is that they might not have got as much from kind of secondary school education. Very, very few of them went on to higher education. I mean, in the early post-war period, only 1 in 600 working class girls went to university, and that's even after some of the university expansion in the 1960s. So it wasn't university, it was secondary school, and some of the women went to grammar schools. That could be very contentious. I interviewed one woman who had a twin, and she passed the 11 plus and went to grammar school, and her twin failed the 11 plus. And she told me about a big argument they just had about that at their 70th birthday party. So they were still arguing about like the rift in their relationship, the rift in their opportunities that had happened from this kind of secondary, being 11, you sit this exam at like 10 and go to secondary school at 11. But even the women who went to the more prestigious secondary schools, they would often leave early and not get many qualifications. But what I found that many women that I interviewed did was go back into adult education when they were a bit older, and that could be for really interesting reasons. So interestingly, a lot of these women went back after they had a baby. They said they became more ambitious after they had a baby. Divorce was another catalyst for going back into education. And sometimes it was just, I thought I wanted this one thing when I was, 17, and now I'm kind of 28 and I've realized I want something else. So they might have been working as a bank clerk or a secretary, or maybe they'd been looking after a young baby. They go back to this expanded adult education in the 70s, and then they become like a nurse, a social worker, a teacher. They might go back and teach themselves an adult education, which is interesting. And so they have this kind of maybe less flashy, less glamorous version of social mobility, but that still nonetheless moves you from a routine job into a form of professional jobs. So they benefit from education and they benefit from the expansion of the welfare state, but in ways we might not think about, and not as long range, not through university into kind of being a lawyer or a doctor, but still really meaningful for like the way women experience their own lives and kind of the shape of the economy in the 20th century, I think.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess hearing you talk, you've just been speaking about the 60s and 70s as these moments for women. And I guess when I think of like the rise of like the professional career woman, I tend to think a little later of like the 1980s and 90s. So I wondered if you could like, tell me about that. Like, tell us what happens in the years after. So we have this like moment up to the 70s, but what does it look like kind of moving forward to the year 2000 or beyond?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think this comes back to different generations of women and different ways of experiencing it. So for a lot of the women that I interviewed born in the 1940s, the way that their trajectories operated is it tends to take a kind of negative turn around the 1980s or early 1990s, because the welfare state shrunk, right, contracted in various ways in the 80s and 90s. And actually a lot of the women I interviewed experienced a form of downward social mobility in the late 1980s. And I think another thing that my work does is think about mobility as both upward and downward. And that's again something that's not thought about as much. And so and we're in a moment right now where there's an increase in downward mobility. Women have really interesting downward mobility trajectories, as in that they tend to fall, they're more often to fall, but they're not as likely to fall as far. And that is because teaching has always operated as a social safety net for women. So like you have this certain set of so they're not likely to fall right to the bottom of the ladder, but they are more likely to fall than men. And so they might have experienced things like redundancy or their job gets downgraded or their hours are cut in the 80s. So it was kind of like a negative sense. And so because they benefit from this expansion of the welfare state, it's quite difficult for them when the welfare state contracts. But in other ways, for other generations, like cohorts of women born a bit later, what we see is them benefiting from, firstly, the expansion of the private sector in the 1980s. And that becomes, then you start to see more from very middle class women, but you start to see more women becoming those, those kind of, they're working in business or working in law, actually becoming a doctor rather than a nurse. So you do get some scope for mobility in the 1980s with this expansion of the private sector. And I think the really important lesson to learn there is women always benefit in sectors that are things that are expanding. So when they can get in on the ground floor or when things are expanding, they're much more likely to be able to capitalize on that. So it's really important to always pay a track and think about where is the growth area in the economy that allows women to diversify what they're working in. So that was quite positive. And then also in terms of education, you finally get the rise of higher education in the 1990s. That happens much later than we might think. So we're really only getting women, and particularly working class women, into higher education in big numbers, kind of from the early New Labour period onwards. And and if we kind of look back to what I was saying earlier, that really matters to women because education is so important as a credential for their mobility. So mobility does start to become much more contingent on attendance at higher education, obtaining a degree. It's very difficult now for women to experience mobility without a degree, whereas there were perhaps other routes, or being a mature student, other ways of on-the-job training that are not really possible now. So we do have, and the millennium is sometimes called like the gendered revolution in higher education, because actually more women attend higher education now than men. They get better A-level results. But one thing that's interesting is that they still don't do better in the long term in the labour market. And I think this relates to kind of a methodological way that I think is important for thinking about women, which is that too much of history is like snapshots of people's lives in time, but women actually have much more complicated life trajectories than men. They're more likely, if they experienced upward mobility, to experience downward mobility later in life than men. They might do great when they leave university, but actually really start to struggle in their 30s or 40s, when you kind of have the motherhood penalty, or you reach a kind of upper ceiling of where you might get promoted. So I think we really need to think of women's lives even now as trajectories, because that trajectory is just much more complicated than their male counterpart. For me, that makes them more interesting to study, but also has kind of valuable lessons for history and now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's so interesting, and I'll maybe talk about this in another episode. But for my work at the moment, looking at self-employed women, that the things you're saying just absolutely are true, of these kind of very complicated, different, as you say, like trajectories, or like going in and out of different kinds of careers. And I suppose it also makes me think that sort of it helps us think about work in the present, where perhaps that is increasingly
Yes.
true for lots more, like for men and
Yeah.
for other people as well, that actually the kind of working conditions or the kind of life trajectories you're talking about now that doesn't feel so unusual, that people might be in and out of different jobs and like lose a job, get a job. So I wondered if you could say something perhaps about where that leaves us today. Like what does your history, like what can we use it for in terms of thinking about the way of work today?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Like I think that kind of, when we imagine a kind of either a middle class man who kind of is a company man, he goes to university, he goes into a career, he's in the same kind of institution his whole career, or a working class man who we think about as kind of working in an industrial job, like those in a kind of community setting. It's like that's not even true for men now, those images that we have of those different kind of middle and working class male experiences of work. And yeah, I think a lot of things, the ways that women have had to kind of fit different roles together, work part-time, work pro rata, and in ways that are not necessarily like great terms and conditions, have to kind of change careers at different points in their lives, adapt around childcare, adapt around big changes, move up, move down on the social scale, is just so much more similar to the post 2010 economy, than those male models. Like we live in an era of vast wealth inequality, classic Piketty model. We live in an era of precarity, the kind of declining status of middle class jobs, bigger rungs between the social ladders, so harder to have social mobility. We have a falling rate of upward social mobility right now in Britain. Much harder to achieve any kind of meaningful upward mobility. So I think that if we do really want to understand work in the 2020s, it is so important to look at. I mean, I'm particularly interested in kind of post-war women's work and then that neoliberal shift in the 80s. But if we go back to that kind of longue durée, that kind of more informal, contingent, precarious onus on you to try and figure out the different, how do these areas of your life or career fit together, rather than having this kind of one straightforward position, is just tells us so much more about how we can navigate the present, and also hopefully how we mitigated some of those issues. So I think another thing, like more specifically, that my work touches on is that there's also misconceptions about the role of what an expansive welfare state can do. And does it make people kind of lazy or not work or not be in the labour market? But actually having a social safety net can actually increase kind of economic participation and social mobility. And so we did actually do some things to mitigate some of these issues in the past that we also, could return to now in the 2020s as well.
Amazing. I mean, that's like the perfect end to the first episode of like, if we want to understand work, we got to understand women's work. And think really seriously about what it means today, but also what it has meant to be a woman trying to make a career, trying to work, and kind of experiencing those ups and downs of life. So Eve, what a great start. Thank you so much for your time and for talking us through these various issues. Super interesting.
No, it's really interesting to talk to you.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.